everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress, and welcome to the first part in a two-part webinar series, Best Practices Optimizing ASP.NET Performance, presented by Web Program Manager Mehul and Technical Evangelist Don Wibier. In this webinar, you'll learn a few best practices, tips, and tricks to improve the performance of your ASP.NET web projects. Mehul and Don will show you how the DevExpress real-world application demos were improved after refactoring. In part one, we'll take a look at the first 6 items that you'll find useful for performance in a large web project. Mehul will cover data access and pivot grid performance, and then Don will cover web chart control tips. And thank you for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul and Don.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Welcome, everybody, to Best Practices Optimizing ASP.NET Performance in part 1. So let me just give you a quick background on how this webinar came around. Now, we at DevExpress, obviously we have a set of huge hundreds of user interface controls. And one of the most common questions we get from customers is, can you show a demo into what's like a real-world application, something that I might create, something that I might use in my industry? And the challenge for us always becomes is that, there's so many customers all around the world that, and so many industries that it's hard to pick any one specific industry. So we tend to have several different demos that we end up creating. And when we create these demos, we find some common mistakes among them. And what typically happens is that we'll start off like you by creating from a project template, creating a few pages, binding directly with a SQL data source, adding some user controls on a page, and we don't really think about performance and stuff. And then eventually that comes back to maybe bite us once we figure out, oh, well, this isn't scaling so well on our actual DevExpress.com machine or something like that. And that's when we think about performance. So that leads me to my first tip, which is actually my first warning about best practices. So best practices are a bit subjective. You want to be careful. They don't always apply in every instance. A best practice means that given a certain scenario, a set of conditions, that it really makes sense to do something. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is that things that we ran into, we said, oh, in this case, we need to apply a best practice for X, Y, or Z reason. Now, this talk is called Best Practices, but really it's Best Practices, Tips, and Tricks. But Amanda thought the name was too long, and she's right. So we shortened it to just Best Practices, but really we've got tricks and tips for you that will be useful to apply when using DevExpress ASP controls in your websites. So the first thing I want to talk about is mainly we're going to focus on the sales viewer demo. We wrote this in 2014, and it's a dashboard style application. So it's got several pieces in it. It's got charts that show you daily sales performance, performance by sector. We've got donut charts, we got bar charts, and we've even got a track bar. Now we're going to talk about the track bar in the next part 2. But at this one, we're going to talk about how this demo came about to be. Now, if you are not familiar, you can find the demo online at DevExpress.com. So if you go to DevExpress.com, and I want to lead you there because a lot of times people always ask me, how do I find your demo? So if you just go under ASP, and all of these demos are available locally. So we've got all of these different real-world applications. We've got an Outlook-inspired app. We've got hotel booking, which we've had webinars on recently that I recommend you check out. But today we're going to focus on a little bit on Sales Viewer. Now, Sales Viewer is a dashboard-style application, meaning that it is meant not so much for input and output or daily transactions, but it's meant to give you an analytical view of sales for a particular type of company. So in this case, we've got a customer's view, we've got a product view, and we've got a sales view, and the dashboard shows you each one of those. Now, as you can see, this is very heavy on the charts. So when we first created this, as I mentioned, it was a bit slow. Now, one of the things we found is, for example, when we went to the product screen, we had this grid, and the grid bound to several hundreds of records or a couple thousands of records, and it was returning some slow results when we started measuring performance on it, because initially, the site looked beautiful. our designers, they come up with this great design, PSD files. We take that design, and then our developers implement it. And so, like you, we'll simply just create it initially without thinking too much about performance, which is exactly the right approach to take. Now, even though, and that's my warning that I'll leave to you, is that even though you may be thinking, hey, these are best practices, do not approach performance as a first answer, meaning don't think about solving performance before it's a problem, because it may not even be a problem. So in our case, that wasn't a problem until we realized, okay, we've got a certain type of application and we need to apply some things to it, which leads me to my first tip. So this is really not just a tip, but it's also a best practice, and I highly recommend this, which is to get required fields only. So what I mean by this is that when you look at this application, and specifically for a grid, when you are getting information for a grid, get only the fields that you're going to be displaying. So in this case, I've got 6 fields, but my products table in the sales viewer demo has 13 fields. So I don't really need 7 of those fields. Now, you might be asking, Mehul, are you talking about getting only required fields from the SQL Server backend, or defining it in the entity framework? Which one does it really matter? Well, the first thing is, if you're not using a middle tier like an entity framework, if you don't have like some kind of business layer middle where you've got a model and you're just doing straight ADO.NET, which half of you responded in this webinar, you are, then I would say to you that yes, in your SQL Server, you want to define the fields to which you're selecting from. So select star is not so bad. Now, SQL Server has evolved so much that it's really it's pretty good, and if your indexes are set up right, it helps. But I would always recommend that avoid a select star from your tables, because in the end it is more costly, even at the SQL Server level. I can't go in this webinar into how table scans work and how even with indexing and caching that SQL Server does, it's still more costly. And you're going to get much better performance if you start looking at the query plans in your SQL and all that. When you select the columns that you need, it's just more performant. But I'm really not just talking about SQL Server when I say get required fields only. So in order to demonstrate this, let's take a look at the sales viewer demo inside of SQL Server. Inside of Visual Studio. Now, this demo is available inside our demo. So if you go to your public documents folder, you will find all the DevExpress demos. So here, under DevExpress version number that you have installed, you can go under Components, you can go ASP.NET, C# or VB, and you'll find all the demos for that we are shipping, including Clinical Study, DevAV, Sales Viewer Webmail Client, and so forth. And so you can open this up inside of the entire solution inside of Visual Studio. Now, let's take a look and see what we've set up. The base thing is that, number one, we are not doing direct access. So we do have a database that we're shipping with it, but we are not accessing that data directly. And to demonstrate this, if we take a look at that page we were just looking at, we've got the products page. Now, I do want to mention that this is not and I think it was already mentioned, so you're probably all aware, this is not a 100-level webinar. So some concepts, if I mention them, they're not clear to you, I apologize. Go ahead and ask them the question. We've got some people that can absolutely help answer this stuff. So what we've got in this setup is that we're using a view where we've got a grid. Now, you can look at the grid, but you can see that the grid is binding to something other than a SQL data source. So if we take a look in the code behind here, you can see that we're setting the data source to something called the products provider, which is this provider is type of products provider. Now, what this is, it points to what we call a DTO. And so let me point you back to the slides here. And this is the first really best practice that I want to talk about, which is when you get required fields, I'm really talking about doing it at the DTO level. So I've got all these crazy terms here: DTO, DAO, Yakhni, etc. And the first thing I want to mention is that what is the difference between a DTO and a DAO? So what a DTO is a data transfer object. And you might just say, hey, wow, you just blew my mind. You know, so what exactly is a DTO? Well, the DTO is sort of the opposite of what a DAO is, which is a data access object. And a data access object is something like what you would use with ADO.NET or Entity Framework. It is those set of classes and models that allow you to actually talk right to your backend. So, for example, your DAO would be your Entity Framework that models the database, and in this case, that's what majority of us do. We have a database, we create a model in Entity Framework, or ADO.NET, or XPO, and then that allows us to talk to it, and that's great because now Entity Framework is great as well because it allows you to work with POCO, plain old class objects, C# objects, whatever you want to call them. And so in that case, it's good because we can apply some logic to those. And then a lot of times we don't actually do this as well. You know, there will be something like a repository pattern, and this repository pattern is great for dependency injection. It basically disassociates this DAO, which is heavily tied to the backend because it basically models it, and to our controllers. Or now, and you might say, well, wait a minute, Mehul, you know, that's actually for MVC. But you know what? You can actually create an exact same type of setup in web forms as well, meaning this type of structure. So for us in web forms, we would still, our view would just be the page, and we don't necessarily have a controller, but we can create that using classes as well. So the data transfer object, what it does, it sits between the data access objects and our view. So let's say in our case, we've got the page, a data transfer object, which is not tied to the database, but it can talk to all of the classes in here. Okay, so I've explained that, and I'll come back to Yakhni in just a second. So let's take a look here and define. So our view is our default ASPX page, which has the grid on it, and our products provider is really the DTO. So what does the actual backend look like? Well, as I mentioned, we've got this data context that extends the classes. So if we take a look at the sales data context, we'll find all of the different classes for product, sale, region, and then we've defined all of the logic for connecting up to it. Now, you might say, wow, you know, that's really a lot to take in. So what I've done with Don's excellent Code Ninja skills is we've created a much smaller demo here. And don't worry, all of this demo code we're going to put up on GitHub for you to play with later. So what happens is, in this demo, I've got a set of classes: address, client, and country. Now, each one of these has subfields in it. So address, as you can see, has street, zip code, and city state. Now, this could could be a typical model for a database backend. But what if, in my view, which in this case I've got a ASPX grid view, I want to pull from each one of those different tables, or in this case, classes? Well, you know, my query would look like select from here, select from that table. Well, that's what a data transfer object can do. A data transfer object can help me define. So in this case, as you can see, the data transfer object, all it does is says, listen, I've got one object. It's really not extending anything or tying anything, so it's not tied to anything. But it does have property names similar to my objects, my plain old classes. And then I can create a data source that says, listen, that DTO, my client data transfer object, this is where you're going to, when I say select clients, you're actually going to pull from the client object, or the address object, or from the country object. And so this allows me to create complex queries, do any sorting, any business logic. So that is great. It frees me up from having to work directly with that backend code. The problem is, I shouldn't say problem, the cost that it comes with is that you have to manage how to write that data. So I have to write the insert, update, and delete methods in how to do that. But I'm only doing them actually here in code, but when I call save changes, I'm using the website DB context, which is using the DB set entity framework to write that for us. So if you're not familiar, if you're not using a middle tier, I highly recommend you take a look at something like entity framework or XPO to give you that extended power. So now let's just take a quick look at this in the web browser. And what's happening here is that I have a simple website that's got basically just a grid view, and the grid view is just binding. Now, when you run the sample, it's going to be empty, and that's because we're just using local DB to create the database. Because what I want to mention here is that when I click New here, and I'll say something like 5, I'll say, let's say Paul, Australia, if I can spell that right, T-R-I-A. Well, I'll leave it alone for now. And then the address will be something like 123 Brisbane, and I created for this demo just a comma separated thing, so I'll just put in some values. And when I click update, what's happening is I'm inserting that record through my data transfer object, which says, listen, I know how to work with that now, but it allows me to do that. Now, you might say, why is that a best practice, and how did that help you in SalesViewer? Well, what it did in SalesViewer was it allowed us to get only those required fields that we needed. So in our case, in the products ASPX provider, if we take a look at the backend again, if we take a look at the definition of products provider, we can see that I've got a view where I'm selecting from the table, and I'm only getting those fields that are necessary. Now, even though each one of these things are objects, you can see it can get very costly per request, per page, if I was to pull in all 13 fields. So now Entity Framework will take care of creating that SQL query for me, but now I can create a complex query. Now you might say, Mehul, there's a lot more going on here besides just this. What exactly is happening in this method? You've got something called try get result, use cache. Well, that leads me to the second tip, and that is to store data in the cache. Now, before I get to that, let me go back one, because I promised to tell you about Yakhni. Yakhni stands for you ain't gonna need it. Now, Julian, our CTO, has created blog posts that talk about what exactly Yakhni is. So let me... Okay, so if you look it up on Wikipedia, it basically tells you it's a principal extreme programming that says, listen, you're not going to need it. Don't implement things until you need them. So what I'm trying to tell you is, for those of you who haven't quite said, listen, I don't have such a complicated structure, that is okay. When we started SalesViewer, we started the same way. We started with like something like ADO.NET, and until we found that we needed to improve performance, we wanted to do some things in the middle tier, that's when we said, okay, now we're going to take this to the next level and actually create that business layer. So a lot of times, if you've got a very simple site that it just does something simple like, hey, 5 people use it for entering data, great. Quick and dirty website could be the answer, right? But if you know a lot of people can use it, that's when you want to start thinking about patterns and best practices. And so a lot of times, keeping it simple, and you're not going to need it, those kind of principles are also just as relevant. Okay, so this next tip is about storing data in the cache. It's a very powerful best practice and tip, but it's also very dangerous. So it comes with a huge warning, and so let's take a look at when it makes sense to use it. If you have data that is static, that does not change very often, caching is a good candidate. If data is expensive in terms of creating or transporting, it's a good candidate for caching. Or if the data must always be available and you can't always rely on the source because it's on a remote server or it's on a web service, then caching is a great example. Now, caching is also great because it gives you benefits, things like performance. So, for example, caching improves performance by storing it as close as possible to the data consumer. This avoids repetition of data creation, processing, and transportation. And it's also great for scalability because when you store information in the cache, it helps save resources and increase scalability. And finally, availability. If it's stored in the local cache, it can survive system failures such as network latency, web service problems, or hardware problems. So caching is great. But as I mentioned, it can also be really dangerous. So when did we use it for sales viewer? Well, we did it in small amounts for really small tables. Things like, certain customers. If the customers' tables were small, or if regions. So we took a look at some tables that we said, listen, some of these tables like products, those actually aren't small. Products has a couple thousand rows in it. Does it make sense to be a candidate? Well, I'll talk about that in just a second. So let's go back to our sales viewer. And we can see in here, this try get result has it's a helper method that we have created, excuse me, for this particular demo. And try get result allows me to navigate to this helper method. Now, why is it not going there? Let's just. All right, so in try get result, this is simply a helper method that we have created. And all it does, it takes 4 parameters. Now, in the parameters, what we've got is the function that we're going to evaluate. And then we got these other optional parameters like use cache, key suffix, non-expired cache that all relate to caching. So what's happening is the first thing that we do is we look at this use cache parameter. And if it's false, which usually, if it's true, then first thing we'll do is we'll say, listen, do I have a key for this? And if not, then I'm going to define a key. And that key is simply something that allows me to identify that particular function. So did I run this before? And to give it a unique value. So it's basically just an ID value that we're assigning to it by getting using its method name, its type name, and a couple of values that we're assigning to it. And so we keep that a key, in fact, and then we take a look and say, look, if it doesn't already exist, if I haven't run this before, cache it. And what we're doing is we're actually caching it in what we call the system HTTP system cache and HTTP context cache. This is known as the application cache. So it's application wide, and it runs for the life of the application. So it can be very dangerous, meaning that you cannot store too much. So what we do in our case is we're defining some items in here for how long it can exist and when to expire it. So this gives you power over not just caching, but that says, listen, this query that I just gave you, this view for product sales is good for 1 hour. Keep it for 1 hour and then take it out of the cache and refresh it. Go get it again from the database. It's very powerful. So in our case, when we did this, for the product sales view, we were able to increase performance of this grid by several factors. So that, yes, we are caching a 6-column, several thousand row grid, but if you got a couple thousand rows, you will be okay. But if you got more than that, don't do it. Use something like server mode or something else. Now, I'll talk about server mode in just a bit. But what we did is, as soon as we were able to cache this, you can see that it didn't affect our web server performance because it's not very heavy, but it also made this view tremendously faster. Now, it also is very static data. Now, this is our demo, so we know it's static data because it's a demo. So I warn you that you want to be careful about how you do that. Now, let me go back. Now, let me talk about the last one because we still got a lot of information to go through, and that is about the pivot grid. Now, in the sales view here, off the pivot grid, we've got a view that shows pivot grid information, but this information can be kind of heavy because what the pivot grid will do, if you bind it directly to your backend, is it's going to do all this summary information on your web server, which makes your web server do a lot of work. Now, CPUs and memories have gotten cheaper and faster, but it can still be very costly to go this route, especially when you're dynamically updating this type of view, because every time that happens, this can put more load on your server. So what we did to optimize this is we know that when you have an analytical view, the best way to do this is to create what's called an OLAP Cube for the pivot grid. Now you might say, what is an OLAP Cube? Well, an OLAP Cube is really created for analytical information. So normally you have what's called the OLTP, online transaction processing, which is for CRUD operation, insert, update, and delete. But an online analytical processing system is created for analytical information. When you want to do things like data mining, when you want to look at historical information that's aggregated, so it can be viewed in multidimensional schemas and so forth. So how do you take information that is set up in your data, that is normalized for transactions, how do you make it faster for analytical processing? Well, you create what's called a cube. And what a cube does, it flattens data, meaning that you don't actually have a normalized structure anymore. It's flattened so that the table now has repeat information in there. But when it's flattened, it is optimized for reads, and it can read up to 16 times faster than a normalized database. But a normalized database is optimized for transactions. It's not optimized just for reads, it's also optimized for inserts, updates, and deletes. And therefore, OLAPs are typically used in business reporting, financial reporting, any type of reporting and analytical. And therefore, we say if you have analytical information, especially for a pivot grid, make an OLAP Cube. Now, it's sort of beyond the scope of this webinar to get into it, but I promise you, if you Google the words create OLAP Cube, you're going to find all sorts of information. And I say it's a little bit beyond because, you know, there's a lot involved in creating a cube. There's a great article on Code Project that I'll link to in my, there'll be a subsequent blog post after this webinar, and I'll link to this. But when you create an OLAP Cube, you really need to install things like SQL Server Analysis Services, and then go through all of these steps in creating an OLAP Cube. And this is actually a really good article that kind of walks you through the screens involved in creating an OLAP Cube. Well, once you have, and it's actually not too difficult, you know, there's some wizards that help you along the way, you can then use data binding to the OLAP Cube. And then the pivot grid is really great because a pivot grid, you can use the pivot grid as a browser. So even if you don't have all the columns set up, you can simply say, hey, here's a pivot grid to your customers, and they can select what they want to use. So you can almost, it's an OLAP browser. Or you can set up your own view and say, listen, I want to do standard deviation. And it's going to do that processing on the OLAP Cube. And you can see that this can be very fast. So the OLAP Cube is one of the things. Now, it's not the main thing that it is the main thing that I'm recommending, but it's not the only thing. So what I recommend is that you also take a look for pivot grid performance at server mode. Now, this diagram is pulled right from our documentation. Now, I'll show you that documentation in a minute, but if you're not familiar, server mode is the feature. Now, typically, regular binding mode, this is the ADO.NET route, SQL data source route that typically we all know. So let's say this is the client machine. And if I've got a grid view and I'm going to go get 100,000 records, what's going to happen is, even though I'm only displaying 20 records, what happens is when I do a SQL data source, it says, okay, hey, give me the first 20 records or second 20 records, depending on what page I'm on. It's going to go to SQL Server, get the 100,000 records, bring it to the web server, and then the web server is going to say, oh, you know what, I only need these 20 records. You know what, forget all the rest. Now deliver these 20 records. Well, that's inefficient because now more data has to go across the pipe, more memory is loaded on my web server. So the smart way to do this is to use what we call server mode. And the server mode feature says, no. If I want only the 20 records, then I'm going to figure out at the server level what the query is going to be and run that query. And this is akin to or similar to what Entity Framework does with server-side paging. Now, we're quite proud of this feature because we had this before even SQL Server, a lot of these other technologies had it. We introduced it first with XPO, and now we introduce it as a general solution for Link as well as Entity Framework. So, and ours is really optimized because we know how to talk to these databases. So, use server mode. Now, the interesting thing with server mode is that with standard SQL data source, you just drop a SQL data source and you say, here's my table. You just put a connection string. When you're using this approach, you do need to create a model. And that's because the model at the middle tier has to be aware how to make that query for the backend. So let me show you exactly a quick little demo of how to do that. So I've got a sample here that I've created, and in the sample, I pulled in the sales view, the large pivot grid demo database. Now you can find this online on our demos page. So if you look at the pivot grid demos, you'll find the large database server mode feature. Now, initially, what we did in Sales Viewer for this view was we faked an OLAP Cube, meaning that in our backend we created sort of a flattened table. So if you can't make an OLAP Cube, that was what we said before, but we made it even easier now because in the last release we introduced the server mode feature for the pivot grid. And so now you can see it in this demo where we've got hundreds of thousands of records and we're using a link server mode data source, but let's say you can do it with XPO or Entity Framework. So that now when I go to the 255th page, all of the summaries, all of this aggregation is done by my backend. And that frees me up. So, and what's great is you don't have to use just SQL Server. Even if you're using Oracle or DB2, our XPO server mode feature works in exactly the same way. Now, to set this up, I've got this simple demo here, and what I can do is I can just drop a pivot grid on here. So if I just, let's drop a pivot grid here. Now, normally, I can add a data source to this. So if I go to the data source, now, I just use the standard DevExpress template here. So the only thing I might want to do is set a width of 100, and then I can go in here and say, hey, I want to make a new data source. In this case, I can use anything from link or entity framework. In this case, for speed, I'll just use the link server mode data source. If I had an entity framework, I'd see the entity framework on there, and or I can use the XPO data source. So, and right now, all it's doing is just creating the link, but I don't actually have the link model, and that's really the key to using this. So what you want to do is you actually want to create that. So I'll just quickly create. I'll say File, New. I'll say Add. And we're going to add a link to SQL class. Now, you can use link, entity framework if you want. And for speed, I'll just call it data classes. You obviously want to make it the names interesting. So what this gives us is brings up the object relational designer. Now, if I go to the data connections, it sees, hey, you've got this database in your file. So I'll say, yeah, that's what I want. So I'll bring this set of tables in here, and now it's going to create for me this DBML file, which is this data modeling file. And what I'll do is I'm going to save this file, and then I'll build it. And the reason I build it is because when I build it, it creates those files for me that I can then use to recognize for my link server mode data source. And then it's aware of them. So now, when I go to this link server mode data source, I can say, hey, listen, set the context type name to this pivot grid data mode server classes data context, which I just created, and then these are the sales that I want. And now the pivot grid is aware of those fields. Now I'm running a little short on time, so I'll hand it over to Don, who's going to talk about the next feature for charting, which is using a common palette. Now, while we switch over, I'm going to talk a little bit about this feature as well. So Don, go ahead and grab the screen. In this demo, we're using quite a bit of charts. Now, charts are really a key feature in a dashboard-heavy application, of course. And when we first launched this, we saw something interesting, which is that when you are using a lot of charts, it can be a little hard on the site. So this common palette approach is something that's really interesting because a chart can have multiple colors, multiple palettes. So using a common palette is not just useful because from a design perspective, because your designers want you to have a common set of colors and so forth, but it's also useful for performance. So Don, why is it useful for performance when you have a common palette?
Yeah, well, if you are going to define palettes for all the charts on your page, that would mean that because this chart control is a server-side control which renders images in memory of the server, which are then being shown in your browser. And if you would load in the separate palette for every control, this would consume more memory on the server, which could better be used for other tasks like caching or processing requests, not to mention the amount of work that it would take if one of the colors needs to change in the future. Then you have to go over all the charts and make that change. And let me show you how this is achieved by saving this palette definition to a file and load it from disk and apply it on the chart. I'll switch over to Visual Studio where I have prepared a little application, and in this case it is having a SQL data source, and I have already set up a chart control. And well, if I run this application, you will see that it looks almost the same as it looks at design time. And I haven't set up any palette features yet. It is displaying units in stock versus units on order from the Northwind database. If I head back to Visual Studio, we can click the task menu of this chart, and there is an option which says palettes. Well, here we have a whole bunch of palettes which we have predefined, but I mean, if we take a look at the Sales Viewer application, it has like a complete custom palette here with colors which nicely match with the rest of the application, and yeah, that's something that you need to customize anyway. So if I'm in the palettes editor, I can get one of the palettes that is a bit in the direction that I want, and I can save this to a file. And I will save this. Now I have forgotten where I stored my project, which is not that convenient. So let me open up my folder, and I'll go back to my palette and save this palette to a file. And I was there anyway. I will store this with a file name which I will call my palette. And I will also make a number of changes to that palette. I can also reopen that file, and as you can see, it has a name which is called Metro 1. I didn't rename it, but let me also rename it to my palette. And now I can start modifying some colors and customize the palette to my needs. So I'll put in a couple of colors that we would recognize. So let me take some orange as well. And let me change this one to something, well, this must make a difference as well. Okay, so this is how my palette looks, and I can now just save it again and store it in this file. So now we're going to need a bit of code to load this palette and apply it on the chart that we have. And to make sure that it runs, I will remove the palette. Let me first show you why it is a best practice to store it in a file, because if I hit OK right now and I go to the source, you will see that with every chart control, this palette definition is being stored inside the markup. And you can imagine that if you need to change that palette or you need to change one color, you have to go over all the chart controls in your application, and yeah, that might take some time. So let me switch back to the design view, remove this one from my markup, and insert a bit of code, which allows me to load in that file that I just written down in the app data folder. It is wise to include that file in your project. If you're using source control, you might want to check it in as well. So that's a quick one. So I will add a class which I will call chart utils. And I'm going to make it a static class because I'm going to create an extension method for the web chart control. And first I will need some code which I have already prepared by using CodeRush, because I can't type that fast. And what I do here is I just define the location of my pallet and the pallet file. And I will also include a static variable which will contain the pallet. What I'll do next is I will insert a private constructor, which will a static constructor, which will load in the pallet by calling the load pallet from file method. That method is looking like this. So what it basically does, it opens up the file in a stream, and I will assign that stream to this static variable. So I will load in this pallet only once, and whenever I apply it to I don't know how many charts, it will be using this static variable, and this variable will exist until your website shuts down. What I will do now is I'll create an extension method which will load in the pallet, or I will add the pallet to the chart, and I will set the name accordingly. And if I want to make an extension method out of this, I can just prefix it with this, and I'll make a public static void from it. So now I've got my extension method. If I switch back to this chart control, I can now pick any of the initialization events, and in this case I'll do the pre-render one, where I can say web chart control sender load, where was my pallet again? Load my custom pallet, it was called. And if I now run the application again, I hope you remember what it looked like, but it was something with orange. So this is the pallet read from the file, and whenever I apply it on another chart, it will be the same. So this Mehul is one of the best practices for customizing your charts.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip right there, because I mean, it's also a great best practice that, as you saw from the definition, that each time, even though in the markup you're saying here's what the palette colors are, what's happening behind the scenes is that charts are server-side images that are being rendered, and so it has to go and load up that not custom palette. It has to go and load up that palette from one of our assemblies, and it's usually very performant if you've just got one or two charts. When you've got several different types of charts all loading up and you want it to be very performant, I think this is a great tip, and I really like how you put it into a utils folder. That's what we do a lot. We create a utils folder and these static methods that can be easily called. And if you were to wrap that chart into, let's say, user control, which we do very often, then you wouldn't even have to rewrite that pre-render method, because it could just be part of the user control that on creation of that.
Oh, so yeah, definitely.
What's next, Don?
Yeah, so the next thing we're going to talk about is, let me switch back to the slide. So basically we've seen the charts, how we apply those palettes to the charts. The next thing we're going to talk about is the creation of transparent bars. It's just a cool feature, and for some, well, I think you can talk about a purpose for transparent bars.
Yeah, so if you can bring up the Salesforce demo, when we created this, the transparent bars was something where we said, okay, here's a set of information that is really useful, meaning like when I look at this chart, I want to actually see the lines behind so that I can tell specifically for this company EnviroCare what the value is exactly. So is it at 100,000, just a little bit above, a little bit below? And so that information is vital And so what we said is that, when you've got, depending on the situation, on the scenario, where this information is relevant to see the line behind it, then this tip can be really useful. So it's a UI tip for presenting information where you say, listen, if I want to see something behind that bar, we can make it semi-transparent. Transparent being see-through and semi being half. Now, is that tough to set up, Don?
No, that's quite simple, because there are, again, two ways of doing that. Excuse me. You can either do that design time, and you can just go, if I switch back to my Visual Studio solution, and we have some really nice design time experience on those charts. I can just go to the wizard, and with the series views I can specify the appearance transparency here.
Nice.
Now on
into the UI.
Yeah, so, but you might run into the same kind of maintenance issues as what I was telling about loading up those pallets. So you can also do that by code, and because we've already did a bit of setting up with my extension class, it's pretty easy to extend that class just a bit. So if I just go back to the chart utils, I can insert some additional code, which will look like that was the wrong one yet, but that doesn't matter because I'm going to need that anyway. I'm doing that again. Probably going to need this one, yeah. Okay, so I have inserted a little method here which is called setTransparentBars, and it takes a control which is the web chart control, and it takes a string array with transparent bar series names. So again, I've set up a reusable method of doing this by code, and it's not. We've got a whole bunch of charts like donuts, pie charts, lines, spikes, etc. And it is obviously not for all charts possible to use the transparency, but all the bars which are derived from this bar series view can be put transparent. So what I basically do here is I will go through that array of the bar series names, and I will make it transparent. And again, you can, in this case, I have inserted an extra method, and this was my actual extension method, which is called applyMyConfig. If I now add a method here, which will call the setTransparentBars, I can just put in the control and the transparent bar series names. What I now can do is I only need to change the call in my render function. So let me hit back to the code here, and I will call this method applyMyConfig. And now I can specify the, for instance, if I want to have the first series, which is called units on in stock, it is. So if I now run the application, you will see that the orange bar is the units in stock. It's transparent. You see, it's like that simple. If I switch back to the code and I want to have the other one transparent as well, because of the arguments that I have been specifying, I can just put the second series in there as well, units on order. If I hit it again, I will have two sets of transparent bars. So this is how easy it is to set up the transparency.
Oh, that's great, and I really love that utils setup there, and applying, just calling one method like that, applyMyConfig, very useful. And
yeah, I'm going to put it up. I'm going to put it on GitHub after the webinar, so you can use it and check it out.
Yeah, and I think that was a great tip that you mentioned as well, is that you don't want to make everything transparent, right? This makes sense for the bar series and the type of information we're looking at, And for example, like a pie chart. Why would you want to make a pie chart transparent, right? Just like
Yeah.
my regular real-life pies, I don't want them transparent. I want to see them.
No, thanks,
whole.
man. I want to have them firmly stuffed.
Awesome. Now, continuing the chart, tips, best practices, what do we got up next?
Okay, so the next tip that we have, and that is also a really cool feature, it is called the AutoSeries feature in the charts. Because what I haven't been showing, the chart that I already set up required a bit of configuration. And I mean, for one chart, it's not a big deal. Let me show you what I needed to do really quick, because we are running quite short on time. I needed to define those series, I needed to create that SQL data source, and I needed to configure quite a bunch of things. And with one chart, it's not a big deal, but if you have 5 charts on one page, yeah, it's going to be some work. So what I'll do is I'm going to create a second chart, but I'm going to use the DTO approach to transform the data that I will get out of the database, and I will prepare it to be used with the AutoSeries features, because in that case the chart will configure itself depending on the data that we are delivering to the chart. And that is, yeah, especially when developing that application with the charts, it will save you quite some time. So let me show you what we're going to do. This is the result that we show in the chart that I've been just showing you. But if we want to use the AutoSeries, then there should be some distinction between the units on stock and the units on order. So I'm going to set up a DTO pattern, and I'm going to use that object data source, and what you'll see is that I will transform the data which was on 4 columns, and I will transform it in 4 other columns, and every product name will have like will be there twice, but the series column is new, and that is something that we can use for the AutoSeries feature, because then the chart will know how to pick any of the items. So let me get back to my application, and what I'll do, I'll create an extra class here, which is going to be my DTO pattern. This class is going to be called product DTO. And I'm going to build this lightweight DTO object which represents the products. And well, what Mehul was, what you were already showing was it's like really lightweight. So I will just make that class look like this. Sorry, not like that. I will make that class look like this. It has a category ID, a series name, product name, and a number. And that number is either the units on stock or the units in order, depending on what the series name is. And you can obviously construct this data in a different way, but this is just to keep it simple. What I'll do now is I'll insert an object data source where I created a template for quite some time ago, which also includes inserting, updating, and deleting, but we are just going to read some data in, so I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to put in a couple of other things here. So this will be my project, my object data source, and this will be my product DTO. So the select method will return an IEnumerable with product DTO objects. And to make that all work, I will insert some other code which I had prepared, which is also some generic code to use ADO.NET to read data out of a database and get it into that, opening the connection and stuff like that. You can check that out as well. And let me also include some code in here, because this is a bit more interesting. I am now calling this SQL read method, which I have created here, and I will put in the select statement that I want to have, and for every read I will insert two product DTO objects. One is the units on stock and the other one is the units on order, and you'll see that the units on order is being put in the number here and the units on stock in there, and this means that we have exactly the schema that I was showing you in the PowerPoint slide. So let me do a quick build to see if everything can be resolved, and let me put in that chart. And before putting in that chart, I will insert an object data source object, which is in there from .NET version 2, and it is a really cool. I still like this object data source approach. I can now select my object data source here, and I can select my select method. I put a couple of attributes on top of those methods so they will pop up at the select or the update or insert, but that's for a different webinar. And I'll hit finish. Let me now insert a web chart control really quick. Let me make it a bit bigger. And I'm now going to quickly assign this object data source to it. If I now run the wizard, I can remove the default series that have been added here, and I can also go to the data and select the auto create series. And in that case, I can so the data source I have already selected. I can specify the series name which is used for the series. I can select the product name for the argument, and I can take the value for the number. And the last thing that I also did in the other one, I had put up a data filter, and that was on the category ID. So if I select that as well, and I'm going to put it to 4 because that's the value that I selected the other one as well, I can now hit finish. And it's now going to take an approach because it's not evaluating that, that code, obviously, design time. Let me do one other thing here before I run it. If I go to the on-pre-render event from this baby, I can just take that same event that I used on the chart above. If I now run this application, you will see two charts which are identical, but the second one is using the DTO design pattern, and the other one is doing the direct connection. I noticed that there is one bar not transparent. That's a bit of a shame. That's probably because I made a mix-up in the name.
No worries. All right, Don. Well, thank you. That was awesome. Could we bring up the slides so we can give people a quick summary of all the tips we went over? Because we went over quite a bit.
Yeah.
I promise we'll have a wrap-up post where we'll put up all this code and the slides and all that good stuff. All right. So,
yeah,
go ahead.
Basically, for general data access, we have like you were mentioning, get the required fields only, store data in cache when possible. I mean, and that's something that you have to figure out yourself. You are in charge of that. For the pivot grid performance, we have the use the OLAP Cube on SQL Server. That would be preferably for the best performance. If that's not possible for what reason, you can use our server mode feature. And for the charts best practices, we could say we use a common palette loaded from a file and use the approach that I have been showing you. Creating transparent bars also by code, because you can apply it on several charts, and use the AutoSeries features. Because if the data would change and we would have like an extra series, we don't need to specify it in the designer of the chart, but by changing the data, the chart will also change.
All right, that's excellent. And where can people find us?
They can just find us online everywhere.
On Twitter? I have a Twitter account?
Apparently, man, and I do too.
Awesome. All right, well, let's hand it over to Amanda. Amanda, thank you.
And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Don and Mehul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.